Hej allesammans och hjärtligt välkomna till ABF Göteborg ikväll. Ikväll är vi jättestolta att presentera samarbetet som vi har med dels Staden vi vill ha och dels globala studier, institutionen för globala studier vid Göteborgs universitet. Rätten till staden heter programmet ikväll. Rättigheter och skyldigheter för medborgare som vill förändring. Vi har internationellt besök här idag. Flera av er kanske har träffat honom under de dagarna han har varit här. Och ni andra får chansen att stifta bekantskap med honom nu. Det är Dimitrios Roussopoulos från Kanada som är aktivist, organisatör, författare och som har varit engagerad och aktiv både kring i World Social Forum och andra sådana. Han kommer att presentera den växande internationella rörelsen som heter Right to the City och som har med framgång jobbat med medborgarfrågor och medborgarinflytande i en rad olika städer, däribland både New York, Montreal och andra. Frågan är då, som vi har valt att ställa ikväll, hur kan medborgarprotester omvandlas till en konstruktiv, stark medborgarrörelse? För det är inte nödvändigtvis så att det är samma sak. Finns det gränser för medborgarengagemangets möjligheter? Och vad betyder medborgarnas förståelse av sina rättigheter men också sina skyldigheter för dialogen med stadens politiker och institutioner? Det är inga jättelätta frågor som ni hör, men vi hoppas att han ska kunna hjälpa oss att tänka kring detta och ge oss mer energi runt det. Vi ska lämna över ordet till kvällens samarbetspartner, till att börja med Hans Abrahamsson från Globala Studier, som sedan lämnar ordet vidare till Malin Widehammar från Staden vi vill ha, som också kommer att hålla i resten av programmet. Hans, varmt välkommen. Jag tycker vi ger dem allesammans en varm applåd till att börja med.
Ja, hej allesammans. Kul att vi har letat oss hit. Jag heter alltså Hans Abrahamsson och jag jobbar på globala studier på Göteborgs universitet. Jag kanske bara ska säga några ord om varför den här diskussionen som vi ska ha är speciellt viktig för oss ikväll. Det har inte liksom bara med valet att göra, men valet är ett utslag av ett problem, tycker jag, som har präglat så väldigt många städer i Sverige. Och det är att städer håller på att glida sönder. Glida ifrån varandra, delas upp i olika områden. De som har tillgång till makten, de som har tillgång till ekonomiska resurser och de som får allt sämre. Vi ser detta när det gäller inkomstfördelning, vi ser det när det gäller också hur hälsan utvecklas i olika stadsdelar. Jag jobbar nu med ett projekt, vi håller på globala studier att titta på förutsättningar för en socialt hållbar utveckling. Och jag jobbar nu med ett projekt inom ramarna för någonting som heter Mr. Urban Futures. Där vi hör och häpna också på uppdrag av Göteborgs stad funderar på vad som kan göras för att hela staden ska kunna utvecklas i takt på något sätt. Och där alla ska känna att de kan vara bekväma och att ha sin rättmätiga plats också i det politiska och ekonomiska rummen. Och vi har just nu på att fundera mycket på hur man kan öka medborgardelaktighet och medborgardeltagande. Och i den diskussionen så är Dimitrios arbete högst väsentligt för oss. Han representerar en rörelse som heter Right to the City som konkret har visat på hur man kan jobba på lokal nivå. Och då är det speciellt kul för oss inom den akademiska världen att se en sån rörelse som Staden vi vill ha växa fram. För Staden vi vill ha hänger ju med i samma typ av den globala rättviserörelsen och ställer samma frågor då med utgångspunkt från Göteborg. Så att vi ser väldigt mycket fram emot den här diskussionen och Dimitrios har varit runt här, vi exploaterar honom hårt va. Så att han har varit runt här på ett antal möten och just försökt att berätta för oss hur kan medborgarinflytandet öka och hur ser det politiska manöverutrymmet ut. Och jag vill liksom uppmana oss alla till att verkligen tänka efter. Hur kan vi göra för att engagera oss och pressa stadens politiska ledning till en utveckling som är liksom värd namnet för oss göteborgare på något sätt. En utveckling som enar staden och som gör att vi alla får vår rätta plats. Så jag hoppas att vi får en kul diskussion ikväll. Hej!
Okej. Let me see. Yeah. I switch over to English, I think, so I want you to hear the first words, and I take some of it in Swedish. My name is Malin Widehammar. Do I have to hold this? No? This is fine? Yeah, good. So the city we want, staden vi vill ha, det handlar alltså om att vi vill lyfta frågan om hur vi kan utveckla demokratin. och hur vi kan öka medborgares delaktighet i att skapa den staden som vi vill ha och skapa det samhället som vi vill ha. Och vad vi har gjort i stora drag, det är att vi har gjort den här medborgarstämman, samma som har gjort i Montreal. I mars, 22-23 mars, hade vi en 2 dagar lång stämma. Vi hade 7 teman. Det var om arbete, utbildning, bostäder, miljö, inkludering. Det var stora frågor som vi tog upp, som vi bjöd in människor med att ta fram förslag hur vi vill förändra staden. Det var ungefär 140 personer som kom och tog fram förslagen. Ungefär 50 förslag blev det som vi valde ut. Och här nere så har vi samlat det i en medborgaragenda som ni kanske såg när ni kom in. Och sen har vi valt ut och prioriterat fram 9 förslag överst på agendan som vi också har skickat in till de politiska partierna inför valet för att få svar på hur man står i frågan, om man kommer driva de här frågorna och hur man gör det eller inte, hur det kommer se ut. Och vi har fått svar på dem innan valet, de ligger också där nere. Så det är någonting vi kan följa upp och gå vidare med. So that's where we are now. We got the next steps to take after the elections. Here we're standing, and you know we have a lot of challenges facing the situation right now. And so it's a really good time for us to have Dimitri coming there at this particular moment to give us a lot of input and inspiration on how we can move forward, and a lot of possibilities, very good possibilities that we can see. And we're so inspired, a lot. Some of you have been there and seen it and heard him speaking. And it has given us so much inspiration and input of what they have achieved in Montreal. And that gives us a lot of hope and inspiration of what is possible. And if they can do it, it means we can do it. So this means a lot for us to having you here, Dimitri, and giving us this great inspiration.
Dear friends, first of all, thank you to ABF for inviting me to be part of the series in this wonderful space. It reminds me of a Greek tradition. The Greeks like talking about politics, but they also like drinking and eating. So this is the wonderful combination here. Bravo to all of you. And I have to say that we're going to do some hard work tonight, all of us together. We're going to use our brain and we're going to use our heart to try to understand some very important issues, some very important contradictions in our society, and try to find some roads in a roadmap for a better future. Let us try to remember 1939 to 1945, the most horrible, the most tragic war in the history of humankind, with over 35 million people dead, children, women, and men. The trauma of that war was so deep that at the end of the war, a promise was born. It was the United Nations. And in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That declaration was a moral document, not a legal document. And gradually over the decades, the idea of human rights began spreading throughout the planet. As good as that was, the planet and human civilization continue to have serious problems, serious dislocations, and amongst these were, of course, more wars, more and major growing environmental problems, economic instability, especially after the 1960s, massive movement of populations, immigrations, as more and more people left their towns and their villages in certain countries, in the poorer countries, moving slowly, painfully up towards the Northern Hemisphere. I need only remind you that in the first 6 months of 2014, over 100,000 people crossed the Mediterranean and today are found in southern Italy. And they're waiting there in refugee camps, waiting to find an opportunity to go into various European countries, including your own. This massive movement of populations has, of course, focused on cities, which has accelerated urbanization. The cities in which these massive populations, not only in Europe, but in Asia, in Africa, in North America, and in Latin America, have made cities larger and larger and larger. The result of which has put enormous pressure on cities to deal with the concrete problems that people face when they overpopulate, when they overflood an entire urban area. In 2003, a very historic moment in the history of humankind, in 2003, the majority of humanity was found in cities. Never happened before, but is of great consequence. So the pressure on cities, the massive problems, as never before seen, has created an urban people that have sought improvement in the quality of their lives, have sought gradually to create social movements, citizen organizations, to demand that the cities evolve and respond to the ecological challenges that cities face more and more. And also, as they proceed to demand changes, fundamental changes in the way cities function, they have raised the specter of democracy, fundamental, deep democracy. People are knocking at the doors and windows of power, centralized power, and they say, let us in. Let us in because we demand to be in and we demand to become part of the decision-making process in our neighborhoods and in our cities. And as they raise this demand, they are raising the issue of the city of social justice. Not only the ecological city, not only the democratic city, but the city of social justice. This pressure is building all over in various key cities around the world. Cities also, by the way, are playing a more and more important role in the global and world economy. You know, as well as I, that the United Nations, for instance, has identified 40 to 60 major cities across the planet that play a determining role in the evolution of the world economy. In other words, they are playing a role in determining what happens in the world economy, as important as, if not more important, than the 400 to 500 major multinational corporations that also determine the future ups and downs of the world economy. So cities are playing an important political, economic, social, and cultural role more than any other time in human history. So, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed by national politicians on the part of Sweden and Canada and the United States and Japan and all the other nation states that were members of the General Assembly. But it has become essential to recognize that in the evolution of things since 1948, and with this phenomena that I described very superficially called urbanization, the concentration to geographic areas called cities, to the point, in many cases, of explosion, the notion that human rights also have a place in cities. Therefore, in the year 2000, in the city of Barcelona, an initiative was taken which gradually involved and involved other European cities, so that a very interesting document was edited and produced called the European Charter for the Safeguarding of Human Rights in the City, the first such document. And it became more widely accepted over the years. Cities throughout Europe were invited to become signatories of this important charter. But this charter, I should say straight away, is a moral document, a moral declaration. By a moral declaration, by a moral document, I mean when a city signs it, it announces to its citizens its intention of doing this, that, and the other thing. It doesn't legally require them to do anything. Nevertheless, if you look at the chapter headings of this remarkable document, you see that Chapter 2, for example, deals with civic and political rights of the city, economic, social, and cultural rights in the city, rights to relative democratic local administration, mechanisms for the implementation of human rights in the city. And under each part, under each chapter, it goes into greater details. I want to bring to your attention something that you would be particularly interested in, I'm sure, Part 3, which deals with economic, social, and cultural rights. And there you will see principles announced, like the general right to public services for social protection. Another article, the right to education. Another article, the right to work. Another article, the right to culture. Another article, the right to housing. You know, we have three basic needs, we human beings. We need food. We need somewhere to sleep. And we need clothing. In order to get these three, we often are required to work. But housing is a fundamental need. A fundamental right, as a result, is the consequence. And the article reads, 1, all citizens have a right to proper, safe, and healthy housing. 2, municipal authorities endeavor to ensure appropriate supply of housing and infrastructure for all their inhabitants. Without exception, within the limits of their financial resources. They must include measures encompassing the homeless, which will guarantee their safety and dignity, as well as safeguard structures for women who are victims of violence or who are attempting to escape from prostitution. And 3, municipal authorities guarantee the right of nomads to stay in the city under conditions which are compatible with human dignity. And then this particular section continues with the right to health, the right to environment, the right to harmonious city development, and so on and so forth. This document, this charter, dear friends, was signed by 22 cities in France, 8 cities in Germany, 104 cities in Italy, including Rome, Milano, 139 cities in Spain. But when I get to Sweden, only Stockholm has signed this European Charter. Only Stockholm has signed this charter. Shame on Gothenburg. Friends, it is now your responsibility, collectively and individually, to get your new mayor and city council to sign this European Charter for the safeguarding of human rights in the city. And I recommend you get a copy. You can consult it on the web. I recommend you get copies and you tear it up in little pieces, put it in the morning porridge of all the city councilors of your city council, and get them to eat it and get them to adopt it. Please do that as soon as you can. But it is a moral document. Now we get to the teeth of the proposition. In my city, Montreal, a city of almost 2 million people, a city that in the greater area is almost 3 million people, we succeeded as a citizen initiative, namely coming from the grassroots up, to work over a 4-year period in a task force on municipal democracy to promote the idea of rights and responsibilities as part of this international movement, the right to the city, which I will get into a little later. This document, and you will see, you'll have wonderful, colorful photocopies to pick up somewhere around here. And the reason why we're doing this is because here is the website for you to see the entire document. And you can see the entire document in English, in French, in Spanish, in Portuguese, in Chinese, in Arabic, even in Greek. Because this document, which took us 4 years to write and to discuss with city councilors, with civil servants, with lawyers, so on and so forth, was finally adopted by our city council in 2006. And don't get a heart attack when I say this. Please don't get a heart attack. But it was actually adopted unanimously by our city council. Don't ask me how that happened. It took a lot of hard work, but it happened. But it is a legal document, not a moral declaration. By that I mean that it has become part of the charter, the constitution of the city of Montreal. To change this charter, it takes a 2/3 majority. It is a legal document that deals with democracy. It deals with economic and social rights. It deals with the environment. It deals with cultural life, leisure, physical and sports activities, sustainable development, and so on and so forth. It is well worth reading. It is well worth reading. And I'm going to draw your attention to part 2. My favorite part is part 1, which deals with democracy. But tonight, I decided to sacrifice myself and to draw your attention to part 2, which is economic and social life. Because, why do I do that? Because of the nature of this forum, but also because all Charter of Rights, generally, including the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, do not deal with economic rights. And the reason why these other charters do not deal with economic rights is because the state does not want to commit itself. The politicians do not want to commit themselves to dollars and cents to deal with certain specific issues. They want to have the absolute and divine prerogative to decide that themselves in their cabinet, their council of ministers, and the majorities that they have over their legislatures. But in the case of our city council, in the case of our charter, we have a chapter, an important chapter, on economic and social life. The essence of a Charter of Rights is this, and this is particularly illustrated in this example. It is a clearly written document in lucid language, crystal clear language. So even the most television drugged person can read it. It is a lucid document which explains the responsibility of the civic authorities, of the city government, the responsibilities it publicly acknowledges towards you and me as citizens. It admits publicly its responsibilities to you and me. This is quite unusual in political life. Usually, governments hide behind a political theology and obscurantism, laws that only theologians or political theologians can understand. But this is not the case here. So in very clear languages, the City of Montreal says, citizens have economic and social rights and participate with the government of Montreal in a joint effort to ensure the continued enjoyment of such rights. They take part in this effort through actions consistent with the commitments stated in this chapter. Commitments, Article 18, to foster the enjoyment by citizens of their economic and social rights. Montreal is committed to A, taking appropriate measures to ensure that housing meets public health and safety standards with regard to the health and safety of tenants, and to provide relocation services when a building or dwelling must be closed or vacated. B, taking the appropriate measures with the support of its partners to provide homeless people with temporary and secure shelter as quickly as possible should such persons have expressed the need. C, taking into account in the implementation of housing measures the need of vulnerable people, and particularly individuals and families with low and modest income. D, maintaining with the support of government partners assistance measures for vulnerable persons to foster their access to appropriate and affordable housing. E, promoting citizen involvement in their respective communities in order to improve overall economic and social conditions. So with this article, they're establishing a partnership with you and me to deal with economic development and the development of the best social conditions. taking appropriate measures with the support of partners, you and me, to prevent and fight poverty and social exclusion. F, providing its citizens with access to quality drinking water in sufficient quantities. And G, ensuring that no citizen is denied access to drinking water for economic reasons. These two last articles means that in Montreal, it is impossible to privatize water. It is impossible to privatize water. And you know, and I do know, that many cities in Europe have these private interests, like crocodiles, waiting to take over the water supply of a city, And some of them have backfired. I know in France, for example, it has backfired so seriously that the public domain had to come back in to put them under municipal administration. In Montreal, it's not even debatable, the privatization of water. So here you have, in a number of articles, a commitment by the City of Montreal to respect and implement my right and your right to housing. The document also has a very important conclusion, which is quite lengthy and is called the responsibility of citizens. Because what you take, you also have to give back. And so there is where a collective sensibility comes in. We live in our own house, but once we come out of our apartment, we join inevitably the community, the neighborhood, our immediate social, cultural, and political milieu. And we have to be part of that neighborhood. We have to exercise responsibility towards our fellow citizens in our neighborhood and the city at large, and that section explains it in detail. This is, I repeat, a legal document. It's not a moral declaration. Now, what do I mean specifically by that? I mean that if you feel that your rights are not being respected by the city administration, by the city government, you have the legal right to deposit a formal complaint to the office of the Montreal Ombudsman. It is an office of 11 lawyers at the service of the public, whose responsibility it is to arbitrate between your sense of having your rights not respected and the civil servant or the politician who you have identified as not giving you the right answer or the right service or the right engagement to solve your immediate need and your abuse of rights. So you have a whole legal authority that enters into the picture. And finally, part of that legal framework is a very important office, which I urge you, citizens of Gothenburg, to also demand, apart from an office of a municipal office of an ombudsman. I would urge you to consider, by studying this document, to also put together a commission which can consist of citizens, can consist of academics, consist of people from City Hall, to draft your own Charter of Rights, which could be quite different from our own, and to submit the document to public consultation for amelioration, for improvement, and then absolutely present it to your city council for adoption. But we also have a third democratic weapon in our armory, which is called the Bureau of Public Consultation, which is a, again, arm's length agency from City Hall, has its own independent budget, which comes from the budget of the city, and they are professional people who organize very effective, very credible, and very democratic public consultation, which involves many hundreds of people and organizations who come and submit their ideas. And at the end of the process, a group of commissioners put together a report with all of the recommendations and then submit them to City Council. So, democratizing the city requires public consultation, institutionalized. I'm not talking episodic. I'm not talking at the behest of the mayor, at the behest of City Council. I'm talking institutionalized democratic tools. It requires citizen participation, which is different from public consultation. Citizen participation means that you also have the right to engage in the decision-making process. You know, the divine right of kings was abolished a long time ago, in the 17th century. And yet, you know, as well as I do, that a lot of politicians think the divine right of kings still exists, that only they can decide important issues. Well, the world is changing, and the world is changing rapidly, and therefore they have to admit sooner or later that they cannot do these things alone, if to do them at all. One of the interesting innovations which may inspire you is that in my city, every city council is preceded by a question period by citizens. An hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. Any citizen can go to City Council, and during the first hour and a half to 2 hours, she can pose any question whatsoever to the mayor or any city councillor. If you want to pose a question to the person responsible for sustainable development, if there is such a creature, you are free to do so. And you get a reply that is recorded, a reply that is made public. So that is important. And in addition, what civil society has to press for is a breach in the dike of centralized power by demanding that there is a partnership between civil society, social movements on the one hand, and City Council on the other. Friends, they cannot administer the city by themselves. They cannot administer the city by themselves. They need our experience as citizens, they need our expertise as citizens in order to have an ongoing discussion as to what are the best public policies. And as this partnership evolves with civil servants, with the politicians, with civil society organizations, eventually we enter the terrain of economic democracy. And by economic democracy, I mean in this instance, the institution of the participatory budget. The participatory budget was started in a southern Brazilian city, Porto Alegre, where in 2001 the first World Social Forum was held. And it has grown and grown so that today there are 540 cities throughout the world that have a participatory budget. What is a participatory budget? It gives the opportunity of citizens like you and me to follow the whole process of the development of the municipal budget, the discussion of what economic priorities that municipal budget should have. After all, it's, you know, the money that comes out of our pockets. So we have a right to determine what the economic priorities are. And that is a very exciting and very important democratic process that began in southern Brazil in the city of Porto Alegre, which is a city more or less the size of Montreal with a very important industrial base. And that begins a whole debate around economic democracy and economic priorities. So there you have it, a whole tableau of tools that we formulated, we advanced, coming from a long history and a painful history in the 20th century into the 21st. And let me conclude by drawing your attention to another very important article in the Montreal Charter of Rights and Responsibilities. Under Chapter 1, chapter on democracy, my favorite chapter. Article 16H, the right to citizen initiative. What does that mean? That means if you or I want a public discussion on public transportation, on air pollution, on noise pollution, whatever the question is, whatever the hard question is, we can initiate a process whereby we sign a certain number of names on a petition, and the politicians are then obliged to have a formal, transparent, and democratic public consultation on the question. And the recommendations after that public consultation are then deposited with City Council. 2 years ago, in the movement called food sovereignty, which means it's a movement whereby people in cities, people in urban areas want more and more the capacity to grow their own food. In the case of our cities, in Canada, for example, most of our food comes from California and Florida. Well, can you imagine these enormous multi-ton trucks leaving Californian farms and driving all the way across the continent to deliver food to our supermarkets? Well, people said, that's not a good thing. So we have to find a way in which we can grow more food in our city. And so 2 years ago, a group of citizens undertook to sign a petition on a metropolitan issue, which means an issue that engages the whole city, not just a neighborhood. And in order to do that, they had to collect 15,000 signatures. And you know, collecting a petition of 15,000 signatures is no small feat. It requires a lot of hard work. And yet, these people did exactly that. They went to public squares, public parks, public libraries, municipal buildings. They went on trams, they went on buses. They went set up shops on sidewalks all over the city. They were collecting signatures. And you know, when you collect a signature person to person, it's not like filling a petition on the internet. You know, you have to discuss the problem with people. You have to convince them that the text of your petition is worthwhile. It's a good idea. So there's a discussion that takes place, an interaction of human beings. And not only did they succeed, but they actually collected not 15,000, they collected 29,800 signatures. That's the enthusiasm that this concept of citizen initiative gave to these people. A really important democratic tool, which you also need in this city. And on that fine note, I thank you very much for your attention.
Our question is, a lot of us have gathered around 14,000 signatures. What do we do when these signatures are shut down because the city refuses to listen? Because you talked about 15,000 signatures being a big thing. We almost reached that number. But when we have a city that is not willing to even negotiate or listen to these signatures or the people behind the signatures, how do we move forward? What do we do?
Well, there are several ways to answer that question. First, the question of residency, the right to residency, that is, I imagine, the prerogative of the Swedish government, like it is all governments around the world. It's not something that a city government can accord. Recognizing the right to housing and the right to social and economic security, then that city government has to accord those kinds of rights to people who live in the territory of the city. The remarkable thing about the Montreal Charter of Rights and Responsibilities, and I didn't mention that, but I will, thank you for your question, is that you don't have to be a Canadian citizen to enjoy all the rights of the Montreal Charter.
So you mean the right to work and the right to study?
All the rights are accorded to anybody who is on the territory of the city of Montreal, whether you are a Canadian citizen or not. That's very important. In other words, even if you live in the street, you're a homeless person, you have the same rights as a person who lives in an apartment. So
how do you acquire that? How do you reach that?
all rights, all important rights are acquired through struggle. All important rights, all important democratic rights are the result of bringing people together, numbers, and struggling with the central power, the central authority. They have to get it through their heads that if they don't accord these fundamental rights to these people, they're going to be in serious trouble. So you have to get a lot of people involved, you have to get the sympathetic media, of course, involved, and you have to confront them not in front of this building. You have to go to City Hall and put the tents right in front and under their noses. There's a big public square in front of City Hall. That's where you should be, not here. You can have an information booth here, giving out information to people because a lot of people are going about here. But the power that you want to get your rights for, before you have a charter of rights and responsibilities, is right there.
Can I just add to that? It's a great idea. The question is, how do we mobilize the people who are asleep, which I find most of Sweden to be. Like, people are occupied with getting more money in their wallet, watching TV.
My dear friend, the people of Sweden that you call asleep are no different than a lot of people throughout the Western world. These are relatively comfortable societies, and they're societies that have been corrupted by consumerism and materialism. You have to reverse that. You have to enlighten the imagination, set a fire in the imagination of especially people of your age, and mobilize. People have a conscience. It may be crushed by consumerism and materialism, but they have a conscience, and you have to appeal to that. That's the way you go through it.
Any ideas on how to do that?
Well, if you invite me back to Gothenburg, I can give you a course on community organizing. But within this forum here, I cannot give you all the tactics and all the strategies. There's a lot of literature, even on the internet, of how you bring people together. But the Palestinian people did not fall from the sky. They created a sense of community. They created a sense, most of them, not all of them, a sense of solidarity amongst themselves. You could do the same thing here.
Okay. We have another question here, or comment?
Well, just wanted to see from a Montreal side, you talked about what you've done, but you haven't talked about the timeline you use, so what people can expect about. I mean, things go faster now maybe, but just to get a picture of how long you do the struggle and stuff like that, and then you reach it.
Well, timeline. Timeline is often determined by the nature of the society in which you work. You know, I mean, I personally have devoted the last 50 years of my life in all of this work, not only in Montreal, but elsewhere. But with specific reference to Montreal, we started in the famous 1960s. In the famous 1960s that shook the whole globe, there were two dominating ideas that emerged in the 1960s in most countries, perhaps even here. One is participatory democracy, which means that we are not satisfied with putting a piece of paper in a box every 4 years and calling that democracy. We want to participate as much as possible in the decision-making process of our society, and therefore we want to create those fora where that is possible. And second major idea that emerged in the 1960s was community organizing, which means bringing people who do not have power together in movements, in organizations, to exercise power from the grassroots together on the power structure, and to demand of the power structure to decentralize its power towards the neighborhoods and towards the cities. We want the power for the people. One of the slogans of the 1960s was, all power to the people. And that is at the kernel of the idea of community organizing. So with these two ideas, we plunged forward from the 60s into the 70s, into the 80s, into the 90s, into the 21st century. And all over there are initiatives, and they keep popping up. They keep popping up, you know, unpredictably. All the sociologists and all the political scientists and all the economists cannot predict, could not have predicted the Arab Spring or the Occupy movement or the 60s, et cetera, okay? So these things happen in an incredible fashion. Listen to the grassroots. Always keep your ear to the ground. And the earth is moving.
I'm very curious about this, the housing, the rights to housing in Montreal. What has happened since they got this legal rights of housing?
Well, very interesting. A journalist this afternoon was very interested, asked me the same question. And I replied by giving him the following answer. No new building can be put up on the territory of the city of Montreal without 15% of the building being available to low-income people. How do you like that? The city of Vancouver, at the other end of the country, is further ahead. And we stole the idea from that city. Like you're welcome to steal all of the ideas that I put forward today to apply them to Gothenburg. But the city of Vancouver has 20%. Not 15, 20%. But in my city, they were a bit afraid to be so audacious. So we start with 15%, and then we say, can you increase it? Can you increase it? Can you? But anyways, that was a very important step forward. Can you imagine putting up a 15-story, 15-floor, luxurious apartment building, and the developer, whether he likes it or not, and it's always a he, whether he likes it or not, he has to have 15% of the building recorded for people who he may or may not like. And the rent, of course, is subsidized, so low-income people can live in it. And if for some fantastic reason he refuses to give 15% of the new building to low-income people, as in the case of Vancouver, he has to give the financial equivalent to a public fund so that the city can build social housing somewhere else. He has that choice if he can make the case for it. So that builds on the right to housing in my city.
Do you have any homeless people, or does it happen?
We have many homeless people in Montreal. many homeless people. We have over 20,000 people that are homeless. It's a great shame that I have to admit that to you, but it's the truth. And there are many important projects that are now being opened up to deal with that very important issue. These are, again, people who come from the countryside, many of them. For example, many of our northern people, the Inuit and the Innu, they get mesmerized by cheap consumerism. And they think that the city is paradise. So they leave their villages and they come down to the south. And they hardly can survive. They fall into drugs, prostitution, you name it. And there is a crisis, which the city has difficulties coping with. Because, of course, the city has a limited amount of financial tools with which to deal with these things. The city of Montreal has an annual budget of $4 billion. And yet that $4 billion is not enough. Is not enough. And the reason why it's not enough is because the other levels of government, the provincial government and the federal government, the national government, take much more from the taxes, your taxes and my taxes, than they should. For example, for every tax dollar, it would be interesting to do the same statistic here, for every tax dollar that leaves the pocket of a citizen of Montreal, for every tax dollar, 60% goes to the national government. 30% goes to the regional government, and only 10% comes back to Montreal. My friends, it is impossible to finance and to meet all the economic, social, and cultural needs of a city as important as Montreal with 10 cents on a dollar. So what happens? What happens is the same thing that has happened in Gothenburg. The real estate industry, which has to pay property taxes, has an easy access to the power structure, and the worms of corruption come out. We had in the last 2 years major scandals, corruption scandals in Montreal, with the construction industry, with the real estate industry, with the construction unions, you name it, it was a bordel. The same thing happened in Gothenburg, because your city is as dependent on property taxes, probably, as our cities are. The national governments take too much. The regional governments take too much. The real needs are at the level of the city. Not with the Swedish military, nor with the Canadian military, by the way. Next. Yes.
Over there, back.
Yes. I would like to know, how would you respond to the argument against citizen initiatives that say that it makes engaged minorities have the largest voice? Have you seen anything of that?
How do you engage minorities?
Like 30K signature in a city of 2 million is really a minority, and thus citizen initiatives represent the majority of the people in the city.
Your question is, how do you engage minorities? Is that correct? Did I understand you correctly? No.
I've heard the argument against initiatives.
Against what?
Citizen initiatives. Like when you sign petitions.
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond to that? That it only engages like small minorities who can make their case instead of a larger population?
Well, getting a petition of 15,000 names on a written petition, okay, is not a small task. And as I said earlier, in the case of the urban agriculture initiative, they got almost 30,000. It takes 3 months. The law gives a group, an organization, a movement, 3 months to collect 15,000 signatures. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of arguing, because not everybody is going to sign the petition. Maybe every second or third person is going to sign the petition. So around collecting petition, there's a great deal amount of debate and discussion and educational activities. So I wouldn't say that it's the consequence of a minority action. The reason why I say that is because the city government accepts the petition. It's an official petition. The text of the petition has to be approved by the legal department of the City of Montreal. It's not something that you and I will write one day in a tavern over a couple of beers and then go out in the street collecting signatures. It's an official, and we insisted on that. We insisted on that because when you and I go on the tram to speak to people and ask them, explain to them what the petition is about and ask them to sign the petition, we have the legal right to be on that tram collecting signatures on the official petition. The police cannot come and say, you have no right to do that. It's public property. It's a public tram. You understand the significance of this? In other words, we are taking public space and giving it to public activities, which is one of the original purposes of public places, to be a place where people meet, where people discuss. I'm sorry to evoke yet another Greek idea, but it is the place where people meet, where people discuss, where people want to do certain things together. That's part of a democratic process. So that's why it's not simply a minority activity.
Was that enough?
Yes, it was. But one thing though, to start collecting signatures, did it have to be approved in some ways? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So that you.
Yes, the text has to be approved by the legal department of the City of Montreal.
By the rights already established in the city? Or like human rights?
That's right. The right to citizen initiative is a legal right.
Yes, but what about the content of a initiative?
The consequence?
The content.
The content. The text of the petition has to be acceptable to the legal department of the City of Montreal. And it's not a problem, because some of us know how to fight with the lawyers. Question there.
Well, yeah, I have a reflection. I'm studying human rights in university, and since 3 years ago, Gothenburg, in fact, is by the political leadership, is implementing human rights, and it's write it down in the main policy document. And I have interviewed some of the so-called developer leaders, and
you mean of the real estate industry? Developers of the real estate industry?
No. They utvecklingsledare. I don't know how to say it. If it means something to say development
Civil servants.
Civil servants.
Like
and those people are responsible to implement in Gothenburg, in the 10 municipalities. The human rights are all activities on all levels and everything. But it doesn't happen. So my question is more like, what could be, because they are aware about it. They are aware about it.
Of course.
But they are not really implementing anything what their own document says to implement.
My dear friend, they will not implement it. The politicians will not implement it or talk about it. You have to implement it. You have to demand that they implement it. If you don't demand that they implement it, It's not going to come from above. This is my experience, personal experience, and the experience of the movement in which I work. We're the ones who created this idea. We're the ones. It came from the grassroots. So we are committed to make sure that it is implemented, that it is publicized, and more people know about it. This is why, for example, we had it translated into 7 or 8 different languages in a city that is multi-ethnic. We knew that English or French was not enough. We had to have it translated in all these languages, and many more. We're still working on it. So it is our responsibility to see that it's implemented. Don't sit around waiting for the civil servants to do it for you, or for the politicians. This is a democratic tool that comes from below. So you have to be part of an organization or citizens committee, or you can do it as an individual, to demand that these things are implemented. There are no gifts that are given by any power structure. You have to demand it and you have to get it. And it's hard work. It's hard work. Let's have somebody else ask a question.
Okay.
He asked the question already.
Yes, it's very good first. I was wondering about the way you in Montreal, the citizens in Montreal are ruling the city and the way they are doing. In comparison with the rest of the Canada, how is there other major cities that are doing the same that you are doing? I mean, if you just take a percentage of the total population of the Canada, how major is the thing that you are doing in comparison with the rest of the Canada?
First of all, let me tell you that these ideas, and many more, are part of an international movement called the Right to the City, which exists in New York and in San Francisco and in other European cities and cities in Asia. So that, for example, this Charter of Rights and Responsibilities has been endorsed and promoted by UNESCO as a very important democratic tool for cities to use throughout the world. And UNESCO has a program called the Right to the City. And that program encourages a university and a community organization in any particular city to come together and to promote the idea of rights and responsibilities in the city and develop a whole new relationship with the power structure at City Hall. Okay? So, for example, this charter has also inspired the city of Mexico to have a charter like this. It has inspired the city of Gwangju in South Korea, the second biggest city in South Korea, to adopt a Charter of Rights. And in 2010, for example, the International Federation of Cities had in Saint-Denis, which is a part of Paris, to have the first World Summit on the Right to the Cities. And people came from all over, mayors, civil servants, civil politicians, local politicians from city council, but also people from social movements like me. I was invited to go to that summit where I spoke about some of the things that I'm speaking about here tonight. The second World Summit on the right to the city was held in Gwangju this spring. Again, there were over 1,000 people that came from cities in Latin America and Central America and so on and so forth. The mayor of Gwangju invited me to go, but for reasons of health, I could not travel all that distance to go. So you have to be aware of the fact that it is part of an international sensibilization, which is now promoted by this World Federation of Cities, which is actually called officially the United Cities and Local Governments, who created this, publicized the European Charter. And interestingly enough, two things I will say, that the role and place of cities has become so important on the world scene that this federation now is negotiating with the United Nations to actually get cities to become partners in the decision-making and debate process within the United Nations. Because from the Secretary General of the United Nations down, they have to admit, as they have admitted, that cities do more, for example, to deal with climate change and environmental problems than nation states do. So they have to sit around the table to also take into account cities. I mean, and I mentioned only one important question. You remember, for example, the world-celebrated film, Unconventional Truth, that Al Gore made. You know, it was quite something for Al Gore to conclude his film with the following statement. And this is a former Vice President of the United States, where he said, it is unlikely that nations, states, are going to deal effectively with the environmental crisis. It is more likely that cities will do major progress. I found that quite revealing. I mean, it was like Ed McNamara, who in his film, where he confessed that he made major mistakes and crimes with reference to the Vietnam War when he was Secretary of Defense. I mean, it was like a confession, public confession that Al Gore made in this film. So things are changing. And the second thing I would like to say is we happen to have in this audience a very important and remarkable thinker in her own right, who is very much an actor in the Right to the City movement international, and that is Margaret Meyer, who's right there in the third row. Are you all exhausted? No. Should we have a beer break or something? I hope the bar is not closed.
No? Yeah?
I didn't really have a question, but when we started, before starting with models, we actually created some study circles, and we read documentation. And to point to the question about critical to citizen democracy is that there's a book from SKL that does investigate this. The scale is like this city and counties. And they start criticizing because they think they are supposed to implement citizen democracy. They think, like you pointed out, they actually think that they are the ones who are going to make it more democratic and they are leading the democratization work. And then they are worrying about how can we get everyone to involve. So I think that's where the critics come from. It's a bit funny.
It is funny because, you know, you build your house, you prepare the cuisine, and you open the front door and you say, come in and have something to eat. Not too much, a little bit. I mean, it's the same kind of metaphor. You know, I'm sorry, but we should build a house, we should prepare the cuisine collectively, and we should open up the door and windows and invite everybody in to come and enjoy the food. That's the way it should be done.
I have a question actually. So first one, the list for get information about the Staden law. Where is it? It's there. Good. Has it gone around or no? So you can pass it around. Good. I'm interested in more. What's your next steps coming up in Montreal? What are you thinking ahead?
Oh, I'm not going to give you my secret agenda. Well, I was being playful, but what has happened is the Urban Ecology of Montreal that has pioneered a lot of these ideas and has created a grassroots interest by organizing citizen summits on the city, 5 of them, each bigger than the other one, Now we are ready to tackle the question of economic democracy. Now that we made some progress in the area of political democracy, we want to start putting forward the idea of economic democracy. And there are two dimensions to that. One is the participatory budget, which I said earlier, some 540 cities across the world practice different forms of participatory budget, which means that you open up the possibility of ordinary people like you and me deciding on the economic priorities of public funds that are administered by the local government. You know, nothing, absolutely nothing interests people more than how money is spent. You can talk all you want about political ideals, but when you talk concretely about how you spend public money that belongs to you and me, there's a whole different level of interest. And it's interesting because it can involve ordinary people in a way that discussions around political democracy don't necessarily do. So we're opening up that door. The other door that we're opening is the question of land. Land in a city is a very important basis upon which to determine the future evolution of a city, the political economy of the city. And unfortunately, our societies, who are devoted to market capitalism, have risen the principle of private property to the point where it's almost a divine rule. And there are movements in North America, both in the United States and in Canada, more and more to create land trusts. Land trusts are large pieces of land, urban as well as rural, but often they are urban pieces of land, which are either publicly owned or owned collectively by the community in which the land is to be found. Now, this idea is now gaining currency, gaining favor, gaining popularity, even amongst urban planners and urban geographers, because speculation on land is considered far too destabilizing in the social, political, and economic life of a city. So they're trying to find a way in which land can move from the exclusive domain of private ownership to a more semi-public or public or neighborhood-based form of ownership. This is not a pipe dream. This is not a dream in the sky. It is something that we in our community, in my neighborhood, we have actually put into practice. We have collectivized, we have put under our control, the control of our community, our cooperatives. We have put a 6-block area, 6 blocks in the center of Montreal under our ownership and control. And as a result, we have the following consequences. This is a federation of 22 cooperatives. As a result, we have the following consequences. 1, there can be no speculation within that 6-block area. That is to say, nothing can be bought or sold. We have taken the 6-block area off the market. Market capitalism doesn't exist within that 6-block area. Second, it has stabilized our rents. Our rents increase with the increase in the standard of living. That's all. That gives enormous security to people who live in that 6-block area. And it is such a celebrated case of success, of people power, that I'm going to Geneva in about 2 weeks on my speaking tour, and I'm speaking at a big international conference on housing to explain to them how we did it, how it works, and how it can be duplicated. So the question of land becomes extremely important in the future planning of the development of the city. And as a result of our success, we have other communities to the east and to the west of the center city who are also inspired to do the same thing. And I could give you those two examples too, if we have time to discuss them. But imagine.
So no buying, no selling, so how do they make their own, they plant their own food and it,
What?
you said there were no buying and no selling, so the food, they make it, the food, what they eat.
The food.
Yeah, you said there were no buying and no selling?
No, no buying and selling of houses.
Okay.
Not no buying and selling of
Yeah, I
shoes.
thought it was like that.
Yeah, no, we can buy our shoes, we can buy our clothes. No, it's only no speculation on property. That's what I meant. I'm sorry I wasn't clear enough.
Okay.
Okay? We can continue informally if you want, but have you eaten enough? Ideas, discussions, arguments? Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for tonight, and just some finishing word. I feel like it's really, like you can say, we have a whole smorgasbord in front of us of all these different tools of how to use to get change. And I think as well, it's very interesting to pick and eat all this yummy stuff that you can use to make changes from this smorgasbord. Thanks to Dimitrios clearing the road for us so we can make it easier for us to move forward. And I think as well, like, it's quite interesting how they implemented the ombudsman.
Right to the city, in which people in Gothenburg have been mobilizing for the right to the city and the right to enter to the country, Sweden, and in this context, make both an approach of, claiming the right to the city for the Gothenburgs, for the right to the city for the people in Gaza. And you know, there are connections between the both contexts, but we have an interesting discussion here because there are some interpretations saying that this is not the problem of the city, but this is the problem of authorities and the problem of the country and so on. So this is one of the questions that may be...
Do you know the story behind what we're talking about? So they were hunger striking for like 28 days. And citizens like me, like normal people, got involved in this, in making the voice heard everywhere.
Mobilizing.
And mobilizing it. And now they negotiated with a migration board, so they stopped the hunger strike and but still they were to for response. And if the cause is not coming, it will not be heard as they want to, then the hunger strike will be starting over again, but in several Swedish cities. And this is also something for the Swedish people to get involved with and try to change.
Our question is, a lot of us have gathered around 14,000 signatures. What do we do when these signatures are shut down because the city refuses to listen? Because you talked about 15,000 signatures being a big thing. We almost reached that number. But when we have a city that is not willing to even negotiate or listen to these signatures or the people behind the signatures, how do we move forward? What do we do?
Well, there are several ways to answer that question. First, the question of residency, the right to residency, that is, I imagine, the prerogative of the Swedish government, like it is all governments around the world. It's not something that a city government can accord. But what a city government can accord, if it...
Right to the city, in which people in Gothenburg have been mobilizing for the right to the city and the right to enter to the country, Sweden, and in this context, make both an approach of claiming the right to the city for the Gothenburgs, or the right to the city for the people in Gaza. And you know, there are connections between the both contexts, but we have an interesting discussion here because there are some interpretations saying that this is not the problem of the city, but this is the problem of authorities or the problem of the country and so on. So this is one of the questions that may be...
Do you know the story behind what we're talking about? So they were hunger striking for like 28 days. And citizens like me, like normal people, got involved in this, in making the voice heard everywhere. And mobilizing it. And now they negotiated with the migration board, so they stopped the hunger striking, but they're still waiting for response. And if the cause is not coming, it will not be heard as they want to, then the hunger striking will be starting over again, but in several Swedish cities. And this is also something for the Swedish people to get involved with and try to change.
Our question is, a lot of us have gathered around 14,000 signatures. What do we do when these signatures are shut down because the city refuses to listen? Because you talked about 15,000 signatures, maybe 15. We almost reached that number. But when we have a city that is not willing to even negotiate or listen to these signatures or the people behind the signatures, how do we move forward? What do we do?
Well, there are several ways to answer that question. First, the question of residency, the right to residency, that is, I imagine, the prerogative of the Swedish government, like it is all governments around the world. It's not something that a city government can accord. But what a city government can accord, if